Hello, and welcome back to our series on building a web server from scratch in C++. Now I want to begin today by discussing the importance of Git and backups. So after I was done creating our project from yesterday, I actually had filmed this section right here, and I substantially messed everything up and corrupted the entire project. And it was completely unrecoverable. I could not get the files back on my system. I'm not really sure what I did. Fortunately, I used Git. So I was able to just clone my remote repository, and all I lost was the work from that particular section, which was not very much. So use Git, use remote repositories, and make backups. Very important. Anyway, today we are going to build off of our binding socket. Now, our binding socket was what would connect to the network and actually bind itself to it with this name. And today we are going to add an extension to that, which is the listening capability. Now, listening is where this socket is going to be connected to the network on a certain port, and it's going to wait for incoming connections. So it's going to sit rather idle and wait for someone to ask it for something. And I was debating how I would implement this feature. First, I thought that maybe every binding socket has a listening feature. Maybe it does not make sense to have something bound to the network that isn't listening. That could be the case, and I'm not really sure. If you know the answer to that, please let me know in the comments. But since I don't know, I'm going to go under the assumption that they may be different, and there may be a bound socket that does not listen. So I'm going to build this as a submodule or a class that inherits from binding socket. So the next question is, what will that class be? Is it going to itself be another version of a socket, or is it going to be the server? Does the socket do the listening, or does the server do the listening? Well, if we go back to our old friend Skrew Everything and his lovely tutorial, we can see that he describes this listening protocol as something that the socket itself does. So this could just be semantic in the way that this article is written, but I am going to continue on under the assumption that the listening function is done by a socket. So I'm going to create a new socket object called listening socket. So let's create that. Okay, and let's open up a second window here, and let's put our header file over here. So we know that listening socket is going to inherit from binding socket. So I'm going to include binding socket. We'll use our same namespace. And we'll define our class. And we know we're going to want a constructor here, so we'll say public. And at the very least, we're going to have this constructor send all of the information we need for binding socket. So first of all, I can use my header file to see very quickly what I need in the binding socket constructor. If you remember the last time, I was talking about how the header file is a succinct way of seeing what a class does without seeing how it does it. This is a good example. I don't need to know how the binding socket is constructed. I just need to know what it needs in order to do that. And I can use the header file to see that. So I'll create our listening socket constructor, and it's going to be passed int domain, int service, int protocol, int port, and ulong interface. Great. Now, when we actually start listening, we're going to need to specify two things to the function. We're going to need the socket connection, and that's just our connection variable from the top level simple socket class. And then we're going to need backlog. Now, the backlog you can think of as a line. So if you imagine that I am the server, and I can only serve one person at a time. In the future, we can actually set it so that it serves multiple people at once through threading, but we're not talking about that just yet. The backlog is the maximum length of our line. So let's say I can serve 10 people in the line. When the 11th person gets in the line, we're just going to kick them out. So that's what your backlog is. So we are also going to add backlog to our constructor. And I want to save backlog as a private member variable. So we should probably change the name of what is being sent into the function. C++ can actually handle when you have the same name as a member variable and as a parameter for the constructor. If I had backlog as the member variable and backlog as the parameter, and I just set backlog equals backlog, it would know what I was trying to do and it would handle it. But from the perspective of someone reading this, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense to say backlog equals backlog. So I want to give them separate names just to make that abundantly clear. Okay, so let's define our constructor. So we will have, oops, I can just see that I added backlog here by mistake. Okay, let's do it over here now. So HDE, let's save over here so we get what we want. HDE, listening socket. I'm not getting autocorrect here, which is worrying me, but that's okay for now. Okay, so listening socket, we give int domain. Didn't spell it right. Int port, ulong interface, and int bklg. And it's going to pass this information along to the binding socket constructor. So we'll just give it domain, service, protocol, port, interface. And the first thing we'll do in our constructor is set backlog equal to bklg. Okay. Then we want to have another function that is going to establish the listening. And what we can see is that listen is set to be an integer. If we look at his actual usage in the code, we can see that his listening function, or the result of the listening function, is sent to the same if statement to test to make sure things are true. So we're going to want to save this as a separate integer and then pass it into our testing function of the simple socket class. So we can define this function down here. So do we want it as an int? No, let's make it a void because we want int listening as a member variable. So we'll say void start listening. We don't need to pass it anything. And down here, HDE, listening socket, not that, start listening, and this needs to be void, and we're just going to call this listening, or this listen function. So we'll say listen, and we're going to say listening equals the result of this. Listen, and we're going to pass it get connection so that we can get that connection variable out of binding socket, which I believe is coming from simple socket. We're just calling the getter function there, and we're going to pass it backlog. And that should set our listening variable. Now, if we return to the constructor, we actually want to call this start listening function. Once it's completed, we'll start listening, and then we are going to test the connection. Since I'm not getting autocomplete, I need to make sure that that is what it's actually called. So simple socket, let's see. Test connection, pass it an integer, and it's void. Yes, okay. So our listening socket will define the backlog, the maximum number of people that can be waiting. It will set a variable of listening to the result of this function that calls listening over the socket, and it will pass on everything else to binding socket. So this is a pretty simple one, and this is probably the one we're actually going to instantiate when we create a server object. Now there's one more thing I want to do, and that's clean this stuff up a bit. So what we can see is that I have my main header file here, and this is intended to be what you're actually going to include if you want to include the whole library. But I want to make it so that you don't have to include the entire library anytime you want a part of it. So let's say I add a bunch of other different things other than just networking. It's kind of a pain to have to import all of that in your project. So if you just want the networking, I want to have a smaller one of these that just has the networking things. Also, this networking folder is starting to get a bit cluttered. If I start adding server objects to this, it's going to be just a mess of files. So I'm going to create some subfolders to organize this a bit. So I'm going to create a new group. I'm going to call it sockets. And we'll put all of our sockets in there. And then I'm going to create a new file in here called hdelibc-sockets. And I want this to be at the top. We'll close this. I don't need anything in that C++ file, but in here, I want to include simple socket, which is parent of everything else. Then I want to include binding socket, which has a child that is listening socket. And I also want to include connecting socket. And then in our networking folder, I want to create another one of these. So I'll create that. We'll call it hdelibc-networking. And in the C++ folder, or the HPP folder file, again, I'm not sure if I actually need the .cpp files here. When I compile it, I don't know if those are required. So if you do know, please let me know in the comments. If I can delete them, I would like to. But I'm just going to leave them for now. And then here I can just say include sockets slash hdelibc sockets. And then in our top level, I can just include networking/networking.hpp. So this top level header file imports all of the components from the networking header file, which itself imports all of the components from the sockets header file, which has all of the individual objects. So depending on what you're trying to make with this library, you can either import just my sockets, you can import all of my networking objects, or you can import the entire library as a whole. Just depends on what you need and will help keep your project nice and clean. So that should be it for now. I would actually like to test this, so I don't think I need anything else. Yes, so I should be able to actually create a test file to see if all of this actually works. So I'm going to try and do that, and I will be back in just a minute. Before we do that, I've gotten some of my autocorrect in here, and I've seen a few mistakes. So I need to specify public binding socket. And if we come back here, let's test that. Are we good to go? Looks like it. Okay, so in order to test this, I created a main function, and this is not going to be sticking around long. I'm just going to delete it in a moment. And in this main function, you create an example of a simple socket, a binding socket, and a listening socket. Now, of course, simple socket is a template class. It's not meant to be instantiated, so I commented that out. And I have it print out everything it's doing in between. So if we come over here and compile it using G++, and then run it, you'll see that it starts, it creates the binding socket, that runs fine, and then it creates the listening socket, but that fails to connect. And we need to see it's already in use. Now, That's an unfortunate result because this is not the first time that I tested it, and this is not the error that is the problem. In fact, if I scroll up to the other times that I ran this test, you'll see that it is saying I am performing a socket operation on a non-socket. And that seems to be happening on the listening socket. Now, once I do it like this, the listening socket seems to already be in use. So I have failed to connect a socket, so I'm going to have to figure out how to just close that socket now that the program's not running. But anyway, that's no problem. So yeah, I will need to go in and find out what exactly is causing this socket operation on non-socket. I don't know what that is referring to, but using this, I can narrow it down to, hold on just a moment here. Okay, actually, I'm realizing something. So you'll see that I'm creating real-time problem solving. This is some quality YouTube content right here. So anyway, you'll see in this binding socket, I am binding it to port 80, and then I'm trying to bind listening socket to port 80. So I am willing to bet that if I change this to port 81 and let listening socket go on 80, we can duplicate the error. Let's see if I'm right. Socket operation on non-socket. Okay, so I solved that first problem. Great job. Pat on the back. So now we need to figure out what this socket operation on a non-socket is. And it seems, I'm going to guess it's right here. So I'm going to put in a little print statement and do standard here. And then we'll print a new line. And I'm willing to bet that that is exactly where it's going to happen. I'm calling listen on get connection. So let's see. We'll compile and execute. Yep, that seems to be exactly where it is. And if I print, just to confirm, let's make this 1, let's make this 2. And then we're going to print 3 there, just to confirm that that is exactly the line where I'm getting the problem. Now, I would use my debugging console in Xcode for this, and I can set breakpoints to do that. It's a better way of doing it. But since I have decided to make this a library, it makes it a little bit more difficult to do that, and this is equally easy. So let's run this. 1, 2, 3, socket. Okay, so it actually finishes the start listening. And then it tests connection on listening, which is an integer. And simple socket test connection takes an integer item to test. So it seems that my listening is returning something less than 0, and I'm not sure why. Am I sending it at the wrong time? Or maybe I'm not setting the right variable. So int listening is private, and I set listening equal to the result of this, and then after that I call this. Give me a few moments here. Let me think about this one. Okay, so my next thought was that it had to do with this order of operations in how we are calling the constructors. I thought that maybe the binding sockets constructor was being called after listening socket, but I Googled it, and no, the parent constructor is called before the child constructor. So binding sockets constructor does set the connection. So I'm going to have it print out the connection here, just to see what it is. All right, let's compile and test. 0. Okay, so it is 0. But that doesn't make a lot of sense because binding socket, or the test connection, is trying to see if it is less than 0. And it is 0, so that should not be failed to connect. Okay, so unfortunately that's all the time I have to work on this for right now, so I'm going to have to pick this up again later, and I'll leave you in suspense. Maybe you see the bug and I don't, so you can leave it in the comments if you can beat me to it. And even if you don't beat me to it, you'll get bonus points for solving the problem. So that'll be all for today. Thank you as always for watching, and if you are enjoying the project, you can subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video. So until next time, toodaloo.